Judge Quintara stood at the center of Space Station Omega-7's grand arena, her 6 crystalline eyes gleaming with anticipation. The ancient Kytherian's voice boomed through the translation matrix, reaching every corner of the massive amphitheater where thousands of beings from across the galaxy had gathered. Citizens of the Galactic Federation, she announced, her mandibles clicking with each syllable. Welcome to the 347th Annual Galactic Combat Championship. The crowd erupted in a symphony of roars, clicks, hisses, and what could generously be called applause from species that had never evolved hands. Judge Quintara raised one of her 4 arms, and the noise died to a respectful murmur. This year's tournament follows the sacred tradition of pure, unaugmented combat, she continued, her tone growing serious. Absolutely no armor of any kind will be permitted. No manufactured protection, no synthetic shielding, no technological enhancements whatsoever. This is natural flesh against natural flesh beings, the way our ancestors intended. In the preparation chambers beneath the arena, various species were already making their final adjustments. The Zephyrians were practicing their acid-spitting techniques, their throat sacs bulging grotesquely as they aimed at practice targets. Their natural ability to produce corrosive compounds had made them fan favorites for decades. Nearby, the Mindwalkers sat in perfect silence, their oversized craniums pulsing with barely contained psychic energy. These telepathic masters could read their opponents' intentions before they even formed them, making them nearly impossible to surprise in combat. The 4 armed Brutoks, meanwhile, were stretching their massive limbs and flexing muscles that could crush spaceship hulls. Their species had evolved on a high-gravity world where everything tried to kill you twice, and they had the scars to prove it. Then the registration terminal chimed with a new entry, and Quartermaster nearly dropped his datapad. The being approaching his desk was small, pink, disturbingly soft-looking, and according to the readout, something called a human. Name? Quartermaster asked, his voice betraying his confusion as he looked at this creature that appeared to have absolutely no natural weapons whatsoever. Amy Kowalski, the human replied cheerfully, as if she hadn't just signed up for what would likely be her own violent death. The alien officials began chattering among themselves in hushed, worried tones. Had someone's pet escaped? Was this some sort of elaborate joke? The human stood barely 5.5 feet tall, had no visible claws, fangs, acid glands, or psychic organs. Her skin looked like it would tear if you breathed on it too hard. Equipment requests? Quartermaster continued, hoping this was all some terrible mistake. Amy handed him a list that made his secondary stomach drop. Bone saw, industrial-grade sandpaper, heavy-duty thread, leather working tools, and most disturbing of all, a requisition for access to the tournament's morgue. I'm sorry, Quartermaster stammered, but what exactly do you need morgue access for? Amy's smile was the kind that made predators reconsider their life choices. Oh, just need to pick up something I left there after my last fight. You know how it is, you kill something really impressive, you want to keep a souvenir. The chattering among the officials stopped completely. Someone had actually defeated something impressive enough to want to keep parts of it? This soft, pink, seemingly defenseless creature? Quartermaster processed the requests with growing alarm, wondering what exactly they had just allowed into their tournament. 3 months earlier, on the mining asteroid of Kepler 442 billion, Amy Kowalski had faced what the locals called Moran the Destroyer. The massive centipede-like alien stretched 40 feet from mandible to tail, with a segmented exoskeleton that had deflected plasma cannons. His species, the Carvist, were known for their acidic blood that could melt through starship hulls in minutes. Moran had been confident, as most beings were when facing humans. After all, what could this tiny, soft creature possibly do to something that had killed 300 opponents? Well, as it turned out, quite a lot. Amy had spent weeks studying Carvist physiology, learning that their acidic blood became exponentially more corrosive when exposed to certain atmospheric conditions. During their fight, she had deliberately damaged the arena's environmental systems, creating pockets of oxygen-rich air. Then, using nothing but a sharp rock and questionable life choices, she had punctured Moran's primary blood vessel. The result was spectacular. Moran's own blood had eaten through his exoskeleton from the inside out, turning the mighty destroyer into what could charitably be described as chunky soup with architectural ambitions. Now, in the preparation chamber of Omega-7, Amy was carefully working on what remained of Moran's ribcage. The massive bone segments, each roughly the size of a dinner plate, had been thoroughly cleaned and were being fitted together with an engineering precision that would have impressed a starship mechanic. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Admiral Vashi muttered, watching through the observation window as Amy threaded synthetic sinew through carefully drilled holes in the bones. The Mantarian's compound eyes twitched with indignation. "She's clearly making armor." Admiral Drohorn, a bulbous Gelturan with skin like wet rubber, disagreed. "Technically, Vashi, those bones were once part of a living creature. They're organic material, not manufactured protection. But she's crafting them into protective gear." Vashi's antennae vibrated with frustration. Commander Tom Mali, a stick-thin Valorian with too many joints in his arms, was frantically scrolling through the tournament rule database. "Let me see no manufactured armor or protective devices, no synthetic shielding, no technological augmentation." He paused, his large black eyes widening. "There's actually nothing here about wearing parts of dead opponents." The three officials watched in horrified fascination as Amy carefully shaped the ribcage segments into what could generously be called a vest. The bones curved naturally around her torso, their pointed ends creating a series of intimidating spikes that would make any sensible predator think twice. Meanwhile, in the other preparation chambers, word was spreading about the humans' unusual activities. The Zephyrians were practically hissing with laughter, their acid sacs bubbling with amusement. "Look at the soft pink creature," one of them wheezed between fits of what passed for giggling in their species. "She thinks wearing dead bones will protect her. How adorably primitive." The Brutox were less amused and more puzzled. "Why does the small flesh thing want to wear another creature's skeleton?" one asked his companion, flexing his forearms in confusion. "Does her species lack proper calcium absorption?" The Mindwalkers, being telepathic, had tried to probe Amy's thoughts but found them unusual. Where most beings had straightforward combat strategies, the human's mind was filled with chemical formulas, anatomical diagrams, and what appeared to be an extensive knowledge of how to turn an opponent's biology against them. "This is deeply unsettling," one Mindwalker whispered to another. "She thinks about combat the way we think about mathematics. All calculations and variables." Back in her chamber, Amy held up the completed ribcage vest, admiring her handiwork. The bone segments moved naturally with her body while maintaining their protective properties. More importantly, they still carried trace amounts of Moran's acidic compounds, which could prove very useful indeed. She smiled that predator's smile again, the one that made sensible beings check their life insurance policies. The next morning, Amy stood in the center of the tournament's technical inspection bay, wearing her bone vest, with the casual confidence of someone who had just invented a new form of psychological warfare. The ribcage segments curved gracefully around her torso, creating an intimidating silhouette that somehow managed to look both primitive and terrifyingly effective. General Kraftnog, a massive reptilian being whose own natural armor plating made him look like a walking tank, jabbed one clawed finger at Amy's outfit. "This is clearly armor," he roared, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "Look at it. It's designed to protect. It has protective properties. It deflects attacks." Judge Quintara tilted her crystalline head thoughtfully, examining the bone structure with professional interest. "Actually, General, I believe these qualify as fashion accessories. Rather avant-garde ones, certainly, but accessories nonetheless." "Fashion accessories?" General Kraftnog's tail thrashed violently, denting the floor plating. "Those are weapons-grade bones from a class of predator." "Were weapons-grade bones," Judge Quintara corrected primly. "Now they're simply decorative skeletal remains arranged in an aesthetically pleasing manner." Amy watched this exchange with barely concealed amusement, occasionally adjusting the fit of her bone vest for dramatic effect. "Gentleman, lady," she said sweetly, "I'm simply wearing the traditional ceremonial garb of my people. We humans have a long history of wearing the remains of our defeated enemies. It's cultural, really." Commander Tom Malley was frantically taking measurements with a scanning device that kept beeping in confused protest. "The bone density is 2.3 times stronger than standard protective plating," he reported nervously. "The curvature provides optimal impact distribution. The pointed protrusions could definitely be classified as offensive weapons." "Could be," Amy agreed cheerfully, "but right now they're just really aggressive fashion statements. You know, like shoulder pads, but with more potential for puncturing vital organs." Admiral Vashi was practically vibrating with frustration. "She's making a mockery of our tournament." "On the contrary," Amy replied, striking a pose that made the bone spikes catch the light menacingly, "I'm showing proper respect for my previous opponent. Moran the Destroyer was a magnificent creature, and now he gets to help me win my next fights. It's poetic, really." This triggered an emergency session of the Rulebook Committee, a collection of the galaxy's most pedantic beings who had spent centuries arguing about the precise definition of words like the and. They huddled around a massive holographic display of tournament regulations, and their various appendages pointing at different subsections while they argued in increasingly shrill voices. Section 4.7 clearly states no manufactured protective gear, wheezed Coordinator Blix, a gaseous being whose voice sounded like air escaping from a punctured tire. But Section 2.3 defines manufactured as artificially created or synthesized, countered Referee Quinn, whose multiple eye stalks were examining different parts of the rulebook simultaneously. These bones were naturally grown by a living organism. However, Section 8.1 prohibits the use of external protective devices, added Arbitrator Zell, tentatively touching one of the bone segments with a sensor probe. Amy leaned against a nearby wall, watching the proceedings with the expression of someone enjoying a particularly entertaining comedy show. "You know," she interjected during a brief pause in the arguing, "I could always take it off and fight naked. Would that make everyone more comfortable?" The immediate chorus of no from every official present suggested that this was not, in fact, a preferred alternative. After 3 hours of increasingly heated debate, during which several officials had to be physically restrained from attacking each other with regulation manuals, Judge Quintera finally called for order. "The committee has reached a decision," she announced, her crystalline voice cutting through the chaos. Article 12.9 of the tournament charter states that any protective gear must be manufactured or artificially created to be prohibited. Since these bone segments were once part of a living creature and are now simply dead organic tissue arranged in a wearable configuration, they do not qualify as manufactured armor. General Kraftnog looked like he was about to have a stroke, but they're still protective. "So is thick skin," Judge Quintera replied with finality. "So are natural carapaces, exoskeletons, and chitinous plates. The difference is manufacturing intent. These bones were not created to be armor. They were created to be part of Moran the Destroyer's skeletal system. The fact that they now serve a protective function is merely an interesting side effect of their repurposing." Amy grinned and gave the officials a cheerful thumbs up, a gesture that somehow managed to look more threatening than reassuring when performed while wearing the ribcage of a legendary killer. The arena floor had been cleared of debris from the previous matches, and those suspicious stains and the occasional piece of unidentifiable organic matter suggested that housekeeping on Omega-7 was more of a spray and pray operation than actual cleaning. Amy's first opponent emerged from the opposite entrance tunnel, and even she had to admit this was going to be interesting. Brandon Torres had once been human, back when humans still meant something resembling baseline genetics. Now, after decades in the asteroid mining colonies where radiation was considered a seasoning and genetic stability was for weaklings, he stood nearly 8 feet tall with arms like industrial pistons and a cybernetic eye that glowed an ominous red. The crowd was practically salivating with anticipation. Here was a matchup they could understand, Big, obviously dangerous mutant versus small, questionably sane normal human. The betting pools had Torres favored 847 to 1, which Amy thought was actually rather insulting to her chances. "Ladies, gentlemen, and miscellaneous sentient beings," announced the primary commentator, a multi-tentacled creature whose species had evolved specifically to talk very fast about violent things. "In the red corner, we have Brandon Torres, 8 feet of mutated muscle and cybernetic enhancement, survivor of 17 mining colony massacres, a killer of the dreaded asteroid worms." The crowd roared approval as Torres flexed, his cybernetic implants humming with barely contained energy. And in the blue corner, the commentator continued with noticeably less enthusiasm, "We have Amy Kowalski, human female, 5 feet 6 inches of we're not entirely sure what, but she's wearing the bones of Moran the Destroyer, so that's probably relevant somehow." Amy waved cheerfully at the crowd, which responded with the kind of polite applause usually reserved for contestants everyone expected to die within the first 30 seconds. The bell rang, and Torres immediately opened fire with his arm-mounted energy projectors, twin beams of superheated plasma that could cut through starship hulls. The crowd leaned forward, expecting to witness the galaxy's shortest tournament match. Instead, Amy did something that made every physicist in the audience question their understanding of basic science. She angled Moran's ribcage spikes directly into the energy beams. What happened next was a masterclass in why humans were considered the galaxy's most dangerous species, even by other humans. The ribcage bones, still containing trace amounts of Moran's acidic compounds, reacted to the plasma energy in a way that defied several fundamental laws of physics. Instead of being vaporized, the bones absorbed the energy and conducted it in a pattern that followed the natural calcium channels that had once carried Moran's nerve impulses. Torres's plasma beams were redirected, amplified, and sent straight back at him through a conductive path that his cybernetic targeting systems couldn't even detect, let alone compensate for. The result was spectacular. Torres's cybernetic implants, designed to handle normal energy feedback, suddenly found themselves trying to process the electrical equivalent of a lightning storm filtered through the nervous system of a creature that had evolved to eat starships. Sparks flew, literally, as his systems overloaded in a cascade failure that would have been beautiful if it weren't so violent. Torres collapsed, twitching, as his cybernetic eye flickered between 17 different error messages before finally displaying a simple, defeated system failure. The arena fell completely silent. Even the usually chatty commentator seemed to have run out of tentacles to speak with. Amy walked over to the fallen Torres, knelt down and gently patted his shoulder. "Nothing personal, Brandon," she said loud enough for the crowd to hear. "But you really should have studied xenobiology before picking a fight with someone wearing the nervous system of an apex predator." She stood up, brushed an imaginary speck of dust off her bone vest, and headed for the exit tunnel. The commentator finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a confused squeak. "Ladies and gentlemen, I honestly have no idea what just happened. Our xenobiology expert is frantically looking through his reference books, our physics consultant has started drinking heavily, and our combat analyst appears to have fainted." The secondary commentator, a crystalline being whose species communicated through light patterns, flashed what roughly translated to, "The small human female has just violated several laws of thermodynamics and possibly committed an act of scientific heresy. This is either brilliant or deeply disturbing, possibly both." As Amy disappeared into the tunnel, the crowd slowly began to realize that they might have seriously underestimated what they were dealing with. The betting odds for her next match shifted dramatically, though bookmakers admitted they had no idea what they were actually betting on anymore. In the preparation chambers, other contestants were hastily reviewing their own combat strategies, and more than a few were quietly considering the strategic value of withdrawing from the tournament while they still had all their original organs. By the time Amy reached the semifinals, the entire galaxy was watching. Emergency broadcasts had interrupted regular programming on 17 different worlds, and xenobiology professors were canceling classes to witness what many were calling the most educationally horrifying tournament in galactic history. Her opponent this time was Mortyn the Formless, a shape-shifting blob creature from the gas giant Nexus Prime. Mortyn's species, the gelatinoids, were considered virtually unbeatable in individual combat because they could engulf opponents completely, digesting them from the inside out while their victims were still technically alive. It was as effective as it was deeply unpleasant to watch. The arena had been specially modified for this match, with drain systems installed to handle the inevitable liquefied remains of whoever lost. The cleaning crew was standing by with industrial-strength enzyme neutralizers and what appeared to be therapy animals. "This should be interesting," Amy murmured to herself as she watched Mortyn ooze into the arena. The creature had no fixed form, appearing as a translucent green mass roughly the size of a small spacecraft. Occasionally, pseudopods would emerge from its bulk, testing the air with chemical sensors that could detect fear pheromones from 3 star systems away. The commentators were beside themselves with excitement, though their enthusiasm was tinged with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. "Ladies, gentlemen, and amorphous beings," the primary commentator announced, his tentacles writhing with barely contained glee, "Mortyn has never lost a match. In 437 victories, no opponent has ever survived longer than 3 minutes once engulfment begins." The crowd was on its feet, or whatever appendages they used for standing. This was the kind of spectacle they had come to see, a perfectly predictable victory by a creature that represented everything natural selection had deemed terrifying. Amy entered the arena to a mixture of cheers and what sounded suspiciously like funeral dirges from species that had developed preemptive mourning as a cultural tradition. The bell rang and Mortyn immediately surged forward like a tsunami of digestive enzymes. Amy didn't run, didn't dodge, didn't even look particularly concerned. Instead, she did something that made every biologist in the audience grab their notebooks. She opened her arms in welcome. Mortyn engulfed her completely, as expected. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable screams and the subsequent liquefaction process that had made Mortyn famous across the galaxy. Instead, something unprecedented happened. From inside Mortyn's translucent bulk, Amy could be seen adjusting her bone vest, positioning the ribcage segments so that their internal spikes faced outward into Mortyn's digestive tissue. What followed was a chemistry lesson that would be discussed in academic circles for generations. The calcium phosphate in Moran's bones, when exposed to Mortyn's highly acidic digestive enzymes, began a reaction that had never been observed in nature. Moran's species had evolved on a world where the primary threat wasn't other predators, but acidic rain that could dissolve organic matter in seconds. Their bones had developed a unique crystalline structure that not only resisted acid, but actually became harder when exposed to it. Mortyn's digestive acids, designed to break down any organic material in the known galaxy, instead triggered a rapid crystallization process in the bone calcium. The effect spread through Mortyn's entire mass as the creature tried desperately to dilute the reaction by expanding its volume. It didn't work. If anything, it made the process faster. Within minutes, Mortyn had transformed from a flexible, terrifying blob into what looked like a giant green crystal sculpture. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the creature shattered into approximately 7,000 pieces. The arena fell silent except for the gentle tinkling of crystallized gelatinoid fragments hitting the floor. Amy emerged from the wreckage, completely unharmed and still wearing her bone vest, now gleaming with a faint crystalline sheen that made it look even more intimidating than before. The crowd erupted. Bookmakers across the galaxy were frantically recalculating odds that had gone from mathematical curiosities to economic disasters. Several major betting houses declared bankruptcy on the spot. The post-match interview was conducted by a visibly shaken reporter whose species communicated through bioluminescent patterns that kept shifting between confusion and terror. "Amy Kowalski," the reporter began, his light patterns flickering nervously. "Could you explain to our audience what exactly just happened?" Amy smiled that predators smile and shrugged casually. "Basic chemistry, really." Moran's bones contain a specific calcium phosphate matrix that crystallizes when exposed to certain enzymatic acids. I just figured Mortyn's digestive system would provide the perfect catalyst. But how did you know this would happen? Well, Amy replied with deadpan delivery, I spent 3 years studying xenobiology before I became a professional fighter. Most people think combat is about strength or speed, but really it's just applied science with more screaming. The reporter's bioluminescence shifted to what roughly translated as existential dread. Are you saying you planned this entire reaction? Planned? Amy looked genuinely surprised. Oh no, I had no idea it would work this well. I was expecting more of a slow poisoning effect, maybe some mild crystallization around the edges. The complete structural transformation was a pleasant surprise. She paused thoughtfully, then added, though I probably should have warned the cleaning crew. Those crystal fragments are going to be a nightmare to sweep up. In the preparation chambers, her remaining opponents were quietly updating their wills. The championship match had drawn the largest audience in tournament history. Emergency viewing screens had been erected in 17 different star systems, and several governments had declared official holidays just so their citizens could witness what many were calling the most scientifically disturbing sporting event in galactic history. Amy's final opponent was Vorthak the Undefeated, and even she had to admit this was going to be her biggest challenge yet. The massive warrior stood 12 feet tall, his natural armor plating gleaming like polished obsidian under the arena lights. His species, the Corvani, had evolved on a death world where the weather consisted entirely of different types of apocalypse, and their hide could deflect plasma cannons, molecular disruptors, and in one famous case, a small asteroid. Vorthak had never lost a match in 47 years of competition. Energy weapons bounced off his hide like raindrops. In physical attacks, simply broke against his armor. Chemical weapons were absorbed harmlessly through specialized pores. He was, by every measurable standard, completely invulnerable to conventional combat. The pre-fight ceremonies were elaborate affairs with traditional war chants, ritualistic weapon displays, and the ceremonial reading of each fighter's accomplishments. Amy used this time to study Vorthak's movement patterns, noting how his massive frame shifted weight, where his joints flexed, and most importantly, how his armor plates moved relative to each other. Vorthak has defeated every champion from the last 2 decades. The commentator announced, his voice echoing through the packed arena. His natural armor has never been penetrated. His strength can crush battle mechs. His endurance is legendary. The crowd roared approval as Vorthak raised his 4 arms in triumph, each limb capable of punching through starship hulls. And his challenger, the commentator, continued with considerably less confidence, Amy Kowalski, human female, destroyer of physics, a violator of common sense, winner of our most likely to cause existential crisis award 3 matches running. Amy waved cheerfully, adjusting her bone vest one final time. The ribcage segments had acquired a slight luminescent quality after her encounter with Mortyn, giving her an otherworldly appearance that made spectators wonder if they were witnessing combat or some form of elaborate scientific demonstration. The bell rang, and Vorthak charged with the subtlety of a collapsing star. His first punch, thrown with enough force to level a small building, connected squarely with Amy's torso. The crowd winced, expecting to see the small human launched across the arena like a projectile. Instead, something remarkable happened. Moran's ribcage absorbed the impact, its curved structure distributing the force across multiple contact points and redirecting the energy downward into the arena floor, which cracked under the redirected pressure. Amy slid backward several feet but remained upright, her bone vest glowing faintly from the absorbed kinetic energy. Vorthak paused, confused. In 47 years of combat, nothing had ever absorbed one of his punches. Things either broke, exploded, or ceased to exist. They didn't just take it and ask for more. Amy used his moment of confusion to study his armor more closely. Up close, she could see what she had suspected from her observations. Vorthak's natural plating, while incredibly strong, it had tiny gaps at the joints where flexibility was necessary. These gaps were normally too small and too well protected to exploit, but Amy wasn't thinking about normal attacks. Vorthak launched another assault, this time a four-armed combination that would have pulverized a tank. Amy didn't try to block or dodge. Instead, she moved with the attacks, using the ribcage's natural curve to redirect each blow while gradually positioning herself closer to her opponent. The bone vest was performing exactly as she had hoped. Moran's ribcage had evolved to protect against attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, its curved structure naturally designed to deflect and redirect force rather than simply absorb it. Every punch that connected was turned into momentum that carried Amy closer to Vorthak's center of mass. The breakthrough came when Vorthak overextended on a particularly powerful strike. Amy used the ribcage's flexibility to bend backward at an impossible angle, letting the blow pass over her, then snap forward like a compressed spring. She was suddenly inside Vorthak's guard, closer than any opponent had ever managed to get. From this position, she could see the minute gaps in his armor plating, tiny spaces where the natural joints flexed. What happened next was a masterclass in applied anatomy. Amy had spent considerable time studying Corvani physiology, learning that their nervous system operated through clusters of nerve bundles located at specific joint intersections. These clusters were heavily protected by armor, but they had one weakness: they needed to remain accessible to the circulatory system to function properly. Using the pointed ends of Moran's ribcage segments with surgical precision, Amy began targeting these neural clusters. Not with brute force, but with the kind of precise, calculated strikes that required intimate knowledge of alien biology. Each strike was perfectly placed, penetrating the microscopic gaps in Vorthak's armor to deliver pressure directly to his nervous system. She wasn't trying to damage him permanently, she was essentially performing acupuncture with the bones of a legendary predator. Vorthak's nervous system, overwhelmed by the precisely targeted stimulation, began shutting down non-essential functions. His legs went numb first, then his secondary arms, then his ability to maintain conscious control over his motor functions. The mighty warrior, undefeated for nearly 5 decades, collapsed to his knees, then toppled forward with a crash that shook the entire arena. Amy stepped back, breathing heavily but victorious. She had won not through superior strength or magical weapons, but through the simple application of scientific knowledge and the creative use of organic chemistry. The arena fell silent for a long moment, then erupted in a cacophony of cheers, screams, and what sounded like several different species having nervous breakdowns simultaneously. Amy raised her arms in victory, the bone vest catching the light and casting strange shadows that made her look like some ancient warrior goddess from humanity's mythological past. In the VIP section, several military commanders were frantically taking notes while quietly updating their assessments of humanity's threat level. The post-fight interview area resembled a field hospital more than a media zone. 3 reporters had fainted, 2 had requested emergency psychological counseling, and one had started a new religion based on the principle that Amy Kowalski was either a deity or the universe's way of reminding everyone that physics was more of a suggestion than a law. The primary interviewer, a crystalline being whose species had evolved to remain calm in all situations, was visibly struggling to maintain composure. Her normally stable light patterns were flickering like a broken hologram. "Amy Kowalski," she began, her voice carrying the tone of someone trying to interview a natural disaster, "congratulations on your victory. Could you explain to our viewers why you specifically chose Moran the Destroyer's ribcage for your, fashion statement?" Amy settled into the interview chair, which creaked ominously under the weight of her bone vest. "Well, it wasn't really about the intimidation factor, though that was a nice bonus," she replied with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "Moran's species evolved on Kepler 442 billion, where the atmospheric pressure is roughly 6 times galactic standard, and the native predators included things that could punch holes in starship armor." The interviewer's light patterns shifted to what roughly translated as "please continue while I quietly question my life choices." So their bone structure developed this really interesting calcium phosphate matrix that's both flexible and incredibly durable, Amy continued. Plus, the ribcage specifically had to protect vital organs from multi-directional attacks, which meant it evolved these perfect curved deflection surfaces. It was basically organic engineering at its finest. But how did you know it would work against such varied opponents? Pressed another reporter, a gaseous being whose voice sounded like steam escaping from a tea kettle. Amy shrugged, causing the bone segments to shift with a sound like wind chimes made of nightmares. I spent 8 years studying xenobiology at the Titan Research Institute before I became a professional fighter. Most people think combat is about being the strongest or the fastest, but really it's just applied science with more personal risk. The interview area fell silent except for the sound of several beings frantically updating their notes and what might have been someone crying softly in the background. 8 years? The crystalline interviewer managed to ask. You studied xenobiology for 8 years before becoming a fighter? Oh yes, Amy nodded enthusiastically. I have advanced degrees in comparative alien anatomy, biochemistry, and something called hostile environment biological adaptation studies, which is basically a fancy way of saying how to turn your opponent's biology against them. I wrote my doctoral thesis on the defensive applications of repurposed organic materials. In the tournament administration office, emergency sessions were being called at light speed. Judge Quintera was surrounded by towering stacks of regulation manuals while teams of lawyers worked frantically to close what was rapidly becoming known as the Kowalski loophole. New rule, General Kraftnog announced, his voice hoarse from 3 hours of continuous shouting. No wearing parts of previously defeated opponents. What about naturally shed materials? Asked Commander Tom Malley, who had developed a nervous twitch since the tournament began. Banned. Banned. Voluntary donations from living creatures? Banned. Banned. What if they just happened to find organic materials lying around? Banned. Everything organic that didn't grow on the contestant's own body is banned. But sir, Quartermaster A interjected nervously, that would technically prohibit clothing made from plant fibers, leather, or any organic textiles. General Kraftnog paused, realized the implications of accidentally mandating nudity for all organic contestants, and promptly declared a recess while he considered early retirement. Meanwhile, back in the interview area, Amy was being presented with her championship trophy and the traditional prize of 50 million galactic credits. The ceremony was notably subdued, as most officials were still trying to process what they had witnessed. I'd like to donate the prize money to the Galactic Institute for Xenobiology Research, Amy announced cheerfully. Specifically, I want to fund a new program for studying the practical applications of comparative anatomy in non-traditional contexts. The crowd's response was a mixture of applause and the sound of several species collectively holding their breath. As the ceremony concluded, Amy made her way toward the exit tunnels. Sharp-eyed observers noted that she was now wearing what appeared to be a fashionable cape, made from Vorthak's naturally shed scale armor, which technically hadn't violated any rules since it had fallen off during the fight and she had simply picked it up. The narrator's voice, representing the collective consciousness of galactic civilization, offered some final thoughts as Amy disappeared into the station's corridors. And so we learned, perhaps too late, that humans don't just adapt to challenges, they study them, dissect them, and then turn them into fashion accessories. They don't just think outside the box, they redesign the box, patent the improvements, and then wear the original box as a hat while explaining why their version is better. Tournament officials across the galaxy are now frantically rewriting rule books, military strategists are updating threat assessments, and several universities have started mandatory courses on human studies, why everything you know about combat is wrong. As for Amy Kowalski, last reports suggest she's already studying for next year's tournament. Early intelligence indicates she's taken up archaeology, specializing in the excavation of particularly dangerous extinct predators. The betting pools have preemptively declared bankruptcy. Other species are, predictably, attempting to copy human tactics. The Zephyrians have started wearing the shells of defeated opponents, though they lack the scientific knowledge to make it effective. The Brutoks have begun studying basic chemistry, with mixed results and several small explosions. But perhaps most disturbing of all, rumors persist that Amy Kowalski has started teaching classes. The course catalog lists subjects like creative applications of xenobiology, advanced loophole exploitation, and something called making friends and influencing people through superior firepower and applied science. The galaxy may never be the same, and frankly it probably doesn't deserve to be. In the distance, Amy's cheerful humming could be heard echoing through the station corridors, occasionally punctuated by the sound of her new scale cape rustling ominously as she planned her next scientific adventure.